Welcome to a new episode in the Reading Through the Gospel series. This is a 20-week Bible study series reading through the story of Jesus Christ in the Gospel of Mark. Last week, read through chapter 6. We had Jesus taking a pit stop at home in Nazareth. He sent out the 12 apostles on mission for a period of time. They come back, get back together, and then we have two very big miracles, the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water. An exciting chapter last week. Let's see what chapter 7 has to hold for us this week. The chapter starts with the Pharisees once again trying to catch Jesus doing something wrong, and they find that his disciples are eating with unclean hands. The Pharisees have this tradition in their culture of ritual purification that they should wash their hands before they eat, because if they eat food with unclean hands, then the food would therefore become unclean. The problem with this is that it is kind of just an oral tradition among the Jewish culture and like kind of instituted and run by the Pharisees. It's not actually commanded in the Bible, or I guess I really should say from like this time frame, the Jewish Torah. It's not really found there. So Jesus responds to this by quoting Isaiah, a verse from, or I really should say the Jewish Torah in terms of like this time from here. But Jesus responds by quoting the prophet Isaiah. He says, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." Kind of calling them hypocrites in a sense, that they have this big show and they get so caught up in following these ritual practices and implementing their traditions when they miss something. They miss God's commandment to an extent. And Jesus eventually says here, nothing that enters one from outside can defile that person, but the things that come out from within are what defile. And giving this response to the Pharisees and really anyone who will listen, that it's not so much about the external practices and putting on this show, but the internal disposition to really look within yourself and not be so caught up in the outside stuff that you miss the uncleanness of your heart. And talking particularly to the Pharisees, that they put on these external shows of pieties, and they put on this whole show with their ritualistic practices and their legalities, but they don't have a heart for Christ, and they don't address the internal uncleanness that they have. Now, what this doesn't mean when he says nothing that enters one from outside can defile that person, he's not saying that you can watch or listen to or eat or drink or consume whatever you want and it's totally fine. What he is saying is, kind of like we said, don't talk this big game, don't do these big things if you don't address where your heart is, if you don't address first the uncleanness of your heart, which he'll talk about more here, because apparently the 12 disciples didn't really quite understand what he was saying either. So he goes back and says, are you without understanding? Let me explain. And he talks to them about how food passes, through the body and out through the latrine, in the translation that I have. Again, kind of saying that these like ritual practices, really the focus on like the uncleanliness of what comes into our body, minimal effects, because food only stays in us for so long and things get passed out. One thing here that is really important, people look to a lot and might have some kind of meaning for our life. In verse 19, we have in this translation in parentheses, thus he declared all foods clean. Tricky one here, because is Jesus really in this moment, because they have from the book of Leviticus, from the Jewish tradition at the time, that they have certain dietary restrictions, right? And if this is really what Jesus says, then this is so counter to the dietary restrictions and the practices that Jesus is like introducing something new. Is this really what is said here? And a few things to consider. Number one, if Jesus does say that he is declaring all foods clean and okay to eat, he would be clearly going against the God-given dietary restrictions that are commanded back in the book of Leviticus, as we know. And what we understand about Jesus is that he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. And this, if Jesus does say this, is pretty clearly going against what that law would be. And it would give Pharisees reason to say, you are so counter to our tradition, and you are saying something completely against this. Forget this guy, because he's not even following our practices. So if we want to ask, well, maybe Jesus is instituting something completely new, it would be a contradiction to the dietary restrictions that God gave. Why would God give these dietary restrictions back at X point and now be saying something different? Almost a contradiction there. Item number 2, I think an important one here, is that not all translations of the Bible, of this gospel here, have that thus he declared all foods clean in parentheses as like a parenthetical explanation of that verse there. In more original translations, more literal translations, things like the Douay-Rheims and the King James Version, it says, and I'll read from the King James Version, because it entereth not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out into the draught, purging all meats. And that as like one sentence, just going into purging all meats as the more literal translation, versus thus he declared all foods unclean. And I think how we can more clearly translate this as within the flow and the context of that sentence, how it's literally translated, purging all meats, as in like pooping, like purging the food that you just ate. If that's the literal translation of it, that's probably what it means. Thirdly, the context of where this comes up, the disciples aren't actually eating unclean foods. It's not like they're, just mowing down on bacon at this point. They're just eating bread. And really the conflict here is just that they didn't wash their hands. It's not that they're actually eating unclean foods. So if Jesus were to say at this point, all foods are good, even though they're not eating foods that are necessarily unclean, seems kind of weird. So what does this mean? Does this mean that we are to still follow the Jewish dietary restrictions? Does this mean Jesus did declare foods unclean, or he didn't declare foods unclean? I don't know. I don't know what to make of it. You make of it what you wish. But I think if we look at it and really ask that question, I think the response is in the context of what Jesus says here in this passage, that his message at this point is there are things more important. What's more important than what we put in is what comes out from us, what is deeper here. Don't get caught up in all these legalities, but what's more important is what comes from their hearts: evil thoughts, unchastity, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, all these things that he says in the very next verse 21 through 23. These are the things that are more important. Don't get caught up in what shall I eat, what shall I drink, how should I follow these rules and regulations. The point Jesus seems to be getting across here is look within at the uncleanliness of your heart and address that first, because that is something that is more permanent, something more lasting, and something more significant that we should give our attention more to. Either way, Jesus and the team go off to the district of Tyre, and presumably trying to find some rest, says he entered a house and wanted no one to know about it. But a Greek woman finds him and is asking for the cleansing of an unclean spirit. And Jesus says something interesting in response to her. He says, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs," which maybe rubs you the wrong way. If it rubbed me kind of weird until trying to think about it. What I think Jesus is trying to say here is that he is in a Gentile area in the district of Tyre, a Greek woman who is probably a non-believer, non-practicer, who probably isn't going to have faith. And as we've seen in past chapters, what we've discussed over the past few weeks is that Mark kind of points out in this gospel that there's this requirement of people to have faith for Jesus' power and healing to work. So what I think Jesus is saying here is, I'm going to presume that you are a non-believer. This woman, that you are a non-believer. So this healing isn't going to work. And I'm kind of tired. I'm at this house. I'm trying to find rest. It's not going to be worth my time and energy to try to do this healing when it's not going to work, when I could use this time and healing for other people that do believe that will have effects. To which she replies saying, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's scraps. Whatever that means, hard to interpret. To which she responds, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's scraps. Kind of proving her faith here, that she does believe that Jesus will heal. And he says, for saying this, you may go. The demon has gone out of your daughter. My bad, the woman didn't have the unclean spirit. Her daughter. She's coming to ask Jesus on behalf of her daughter. Lastly, the team travels through Sidon to the district of the Decapolis, so kind of a city center here. And a deaf man with a speech impediment comes up to Jesus. And this healing, what Jesus does next, is probably one of the weirdest things that I've ever heard, let alone in the Bible. The way that Jesus heals this man, he put his finger into the man's ears and spitting, touched his tongue. Then he looked up to heaven and groaned and said, Ephatha. It's a good thing that it says that Jesus took him off by himself away from the crowd, because this would just be the most bizarre thing to hear. What does this look like? Does he put one finger in his ear? Does he put two fingers in both sides of his ears? Does he do one finger and then the other finger? What does he use to touch his tongue? Is it two fingers in the ears and he touches his tongue with his nose or something? Where does he spit? Does he spit on the ground? Does he spit on the guy? Does he spit in his ears? Does he spit on his tongue? He looks up and groans while he's got his fingers in his ears, and he says whatever. That is just one of the most bizarre sounding words. All of this has got to be I think it would be humorous just to see what this looks like. Obviously a miraculous healing by Jesus in a powerful moment of his ministry, but a little bit bizarre. And one of those stories that we just look at and think what is this? Why did you do it this way, Jesus? Nonetheless, that is chapter 7 of the Gospel of Mark. Hopefully you got something out of it, whatever it may have been. If you did, let me know in the comments below. Leave a like on this video, and let me know if you've been watching this series so far, getting anything out of it. That's all we got for chapter 7 this week. Hopefully to see you again next week for Mark chapter 8.